So I'll start just to make sure that we're all on the same page. One of the common misconceptions, as you say, about street gangs and gang members is how do we actually determine what a gang is and who is a gang member? The Sheriff's Office uses the definition found in the RCWs for criminal street gang, which is the definition found at the bottom there in that section, 9.948.030, parent 12. And it's essentially 3 or more people who have a common name, sign, symbol, or color, who have as one of their primary activities the commission of criminal acts, and his members have engaged in that activity within the past 3 years. So we need, before a group can be called a criminal street gang, there has to be 3.
There has to be 3 or more members?
I'm sorry, I accidentally hit the button.
Yeah.
You have to have 3 or more members.
Okay.
So obviously 2 people is not a gang.
All right.
We have to have common identifying symbols, and we have to have criminal activity being a primary reason for the group's existence. It doesn't have to be the sole reason, but that has to be one of the main reasons the group exists. And that prong, frankly, is one of the most important ones, because that's what separates a group of kids that hang out at a skate park and give themselves a common name from an actual criminal street gang. The criminal element, the criminal activity is a very, very important factor of it. And then the final prong establishes that criminal activity has to be ongoing. It has to continue. It can't be something that occurred 5 years ago and then stopped, because we will no longer call that group a gang. It has to be continuous, and it has to be within the past 3 years. So when I say we have a certain number of criminal street gangs, or when I'm referencing a criminal street gang, any one of those gangs has met this definition here.
All right.
And then for criminal street gang member or associate, it's a very open idea, and it's very different across a lot of across the state, even across different states. We use the RCW definition once again, which is the next section, parent 13. Criminal street gang member or associate is a person who actively participates in a criminal street gang and commits a criminal act essentially on behalf of or at the direction of the criminal street gang. And this is a very very broad section when you look at just the phrase actively participates. And so there are sets of criteria that we use, and we have labeled out those criteria to be as objective as possible to remove any of those subjective factors. For example, California under CalGang, they have massive problems with their gang database system because they use two criteria in combination: associates with gang members and frequents gang territories. Every day at work, I meet those 2 criteria. So it's a very subjective as to what's gang territory or what's a gang area, as to who a gang member is, and obviously that can wrap up family members, little brothers hanging out with their older brother, and we want to make sure that we are not doing that. So we've eliminated any of those subjective factors of criteria. So when I talk about a criminal street gang member or associate, there has to be that criminal activity present, and they have to be a participant in the criminal street gang, not just somebody that's hanging out, not just somebody that's there because they think it's cool. So in terms of our overall picture here, we have 116 active criminal street gangs in King County as of essentially last night, which might seem like a lot. We have an additional 67 street gangs that are represented by active members in our community in King County. These are criminal street gangs that are from another place in the state or from another place in the country where we have less than 3 members in our area, or where the gang does not have an active presence, but the members are active under that gang name. So just to differentiate it as to the type of gangs. We're also tracking 6 what are called threat groups. These are groups that have started to display some of that criminal gang style activity, groups of individuals with common name or identifying symbols and engaging in criminal activity. And we are in the process of determining whether or not they actually meet that definition of a criminal street gang, or whether it's that group of kids that has a couple of criminals as members, and trying to draw the line and differentiate the two.
Okay.
Because obviously,
can I stop you for a second?
Absolutely.
Because I'd like to ask you a question. The 116 active and 67 additional street gangs, does that mean all 183 of these groups have already met the definition that you just shared with us a little earlier?
Yes.
And it's, okay.
The 67 are groups that have, one or two members. In most of their cases, there's one or two members. They may be from the group itself. The gang may be from Eastern Washington, or it may be from Los Angeles or Chicago. So there are individuals that are here acting under that gang's name, but the gang itself doesn't have a presence.
Okay, so that's why it can be less than the 3 that you referenced earlier to be labeled a gang in King County.
Yes.
Okay, and that's the 67. But in the 116, you and your staff believe that there, in each of those sets, that there are at least 3 or more members.
Yes.
All right, proceed.
So we're tracking, back to the threat groups, we are tracking 6 threat groups that we are trying to determine whether or not they will meet that.
Are you saying 6 threat, THREAT
Yes, sir.
groups? Okay, go ahead.
And usually what happens in the case of those threat groups is they end up fizzling out and going away. Very rarely do the threat groups actually end up becoming criminal street gangs.
All right.
In terms of our membership, it's an estimate approximately 15,000 gang members in King County as a whole. That number, I'll tell you right now, does include incarcerated individuals, because I don't have a way to separate that out. So actual membership in the streets will be a little bit less than that. It runs out to roughly 0.67% of the population of King County, using that 2.233 million.
Wait a minute, what percentage?
0.67%.
Okay, I didn't hear you say.
And just for comparison, Los Angeles has 450 active criminal street gangs, membership of 45,000. They have 1.13% of their population. And Los Angeles County has 1,462 active criminal street gangs with 168,000 members for a 1.67% population. So when you look at those two numbers in comparison to ours, our gang density is obviously nowhere near that of the gang capital, but it kind of gives you a little bit of perspective as to what those numbers actually represent. 15,000 can seem like a lot, and in reality, it's a lot better than it could be.
Okay.
When most people think of street gangs, as you were mentioning earlier, they have that image that's put into their head, and usually that's an image from mass media. It's from music or television. It's from the news. It's not something that a lot of people have a personal experience with, or if they do, they don't quite recognize what they're looking at, and they may have a preconceived notion or a misconception of what criminal street gangs are. And most people, when they think of street gangs, they picture something like this. They picture groups of individuals of a common race or ethnicity. They picture the bandanas, the common colors. They picture hand signs. That's a very common idea of what people usually think of when they think of street gangs. The reality of criminal street gangs is much, much different than what's in those pictures, than what's in that common idea of what criminal street gangs are. Gangs don't discriminate at all based on race. All races are involved in criminal street gangs. We have all white criminal street gangs. It used to be that gangs were called black gangs or Hispanic gangs or Asian gangs. If you ever hear those terms, there should be the word predominantly put in front of it, because for most gangs, race means actually absolutely nothing. Even white supremacists, race really doesn't mean that much with white supremacist gangs either.
You've seen some blacks and Latinos in white supremacy gangs?
I have.
You have?
Usually not blacks, no. But the Nazi lowriders in California is a prison gang and a street gang. And you can be a member of the Nazi lowriders and be half Hispanic or half Asian. They do not care, as long as you have no black blood and you completely disavow your non-white blood. There are Nazi lowriders with the last name Hernandez, Gutierrez, Nguyen. Means absolutely nothing.
Okay.
When I was in California, we had a skinhead gang start up called The Family. And they were white supremacists, but they allowed Filipinos as members. So it really doesn't matter. if you look back to World War II, even the actual Nazis didn't care. The Waffen-SS had a Jewish battalion. They had a battalion of the Slavic races, which they considered the Untermensch. So if the actual Nazis didn't care, I'm not sure if our street Nazis are going to really care that much.
All right, proceed.
But even those gangs that you would normally think of as, Hispanic gangs, and there's all this, talk in the news media about Latino gangs, Hispanic gangs, but all races are involved. Applying just a single gender or ethnicity or race to it is completely inaccurate. Gangs don't discriminate at all. I'm sorry.
Excuse me. Mr. Zimmerman, you can't be laughing and carrying on like that while we have a presentation. No, but you, if we hear from you one more time, you're going to have to leave. Okay, go ahead.
Gangs don't discriminate at all based on gender. There's a lot of people that think females aren't involved in criminal street gangs, or they think that if the females are involved, it's simply because the males are using them to hold guns or narcotics or contraband because male officers can't search them as well. And that's just 1970s knowledge. Females are just as active in criminal street gangs as their male counterparts. We have all female criminal street gangs. We have a brand new one.
Is it true that a police officer can't search a female?
Oh, we can search them, but you can't search them as thoroughly as a male. So we have to call a female officer over.
All right.
So there's plenty of instances of females targeting not only rival female gang members, but rival male members as well. So the idea that females aren't involved in gangs is something that I always like to
That's a false perception.
It actually is. Almost a third of gang membership is female, in fact. And then age.
Age?
Is something that...
I'm sure you have to be 16.
Gang members don't discriminate at all based on age. We have a disturbing trend called multi-generational criminal street gangs. Gang members that can trace their roots in a criminal street gang through their parents, their grandparents, essentially children that are born into the gang lifestyle and the gang culture. And when you think about it, if you have two parents that are involved in that gang life, that gang culture, how are they going to raise their child? We raise our children with the same societal mores and values that we hold as parents, right? We teach them how to act, and we show them how to act. And if you have two parents that are in that same mindset and mentality, that's how they will raise their child. So that's a big problem that we're dealing with. The other aspect of age is that gangs know the way the juvenile justice system works. They know it's geared towards rehabilitation, and rightly so. We understand that it's not the child's fault. We want to make that child a productive member of society and give them chances to do that. But the gangs understand that. And they know that they're going to get a lot more work out of a 14-year-old than they are out of a 17 or an 18-year-old. And so gangs are recruiting at younger ages. They're putting guns in the hand of kids at younger ages. They're able to mold and manipulate kids easier than adults for obvious reasons. And so we're seeing a lot more juvenile activity.
Are these pictures all taken from Washington State?
Let's see. All except the newspaper article on the lower right and the young baby in the center. The rest of them are all Washington State pictures.
All right.
So even if the gangs affect everyone is the bottom line. Gangs affect every community, every aspect of the community, and every member in those communities. So I was going to talk real quick about some of the current trends, and then I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about our involvement in how we're addressing street gangs and such.
Go ahead.
And I mentioned this earlier, the increasing involvement of juveniles. Gangs have always focused on juveniles. It's their next generation. It's how they keep themselves moving. And gang membership in the early ages of 6, 7, 8 years old is nothing new in places like Chicago and in Los Angeles. But it is relatively new that we're starting to see that phenomenon up here. It used to be, I remember in 2007 or so, I talked to a kid who said they wouldn't let him join his gang until he was 14. That gang had a specific age. This summer, that gang was putting on kids at 10 years old. So they've obviously changed that rule. The gang, like I said, they know, in general, the gangs know the way that that system works, and so they're using it. They know that they get a lot more work out of kids. They know that kids get booked into juvie for a gun, they're going to be right back out on the street within 24 hours. And the sad fact is that it used to be that carrying a gun in gang culture didn't mean that you were ready to use it. It meant that you were just feeling powerful, or you wanted it for protection, or that it was an ego boost or a reputation booster within the gang. But some of that gang culture has changed now, and everybody who knows that you're carrying that gun expects you to use that gun. And so it has a very different meaning at this point, where sometimes if you have a gun and you don't use it, you will actually catch a violation from your own gang. Your own gang will punish you for not using that gun when you should have. There's some very different connotations behind that now. So we're seeing that recruitment at younger ages, and we're seeing the gang leadership or the gang's elders increasingly leaning on juveniles to commit those violent acts, because they know that the punishment isn't going to be as severe, or that they're going to get more work out of that juvenile before the punishment is finally laid down. The current crop that we've been seeing of new gang members in Burien and White Center, for example, over this summer, the ages that we started seeing them coming in were around 13, 14 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's just when they're coming to our attention. That's when they're on our radar, which means you might even see, I mean, you're going to see that recruiting and grooming activity occurring even younger. I can relate a story at a later date or at a later time, if you like, about some of the specifics of how that they're using to recruit, and that starts around 6 or 7 years old. One of the other things that we're seeing is increasing connections between the street and the prisons. Again, nothing new in other parts of the United States, and in some parts of our state, not so much, but the part of the trend here that's different is that specifically with our Sureño gangs, which is predominantly Hispanic, we're seeing increasing control from the prison, the state prisons and from federal prison, over our street gangs. Individuals coming out of those prisons carrying specific level controls over certain gangs, over certain areas, and being able to either create or stop conflict just based on a simple order. And then, unfortunately, the connections with that also go back and forth with different levels of crimes and such as well. And then the increasing membership in non-traditional criminal street gangs. And when I say traditional criminal street gangs, I'm thinking what most people think of: Crip, Blood, Sureño, Norteño, Gangster Disciple, People's Nation, Latin Kings. Our non-traditional criminal street gangs are criminal street gangs that are going to be more local identifier, that don't have a national affiliation, that are going to be not on that national radar, something that pops up in an area that is specific to that area and wouldn't mean anything to somebody outside of it. Yeah. This type of street gang is a lot harder for law enforcement to track and identify, because it obviously doesn't share any of the symbols with established national gangs. So we have to, right off the bat, figure out if this is a criminal street gang, what those identifiers are, and then figure out what kind of structure and membership and such it has. So it's something that can oftentimes get missed or dismissed until it very suddenly becomes a problem. So that membership in non-traditional street gangs is something that we're watching and trying to get ahead of as well.
Okay.
And I'd be happy to answer any questions you have about the
well, first of all, we appreciate you being willing to put this kind of presentation together, because it's helpful to us being updated. One of the things that's surprising to me about what you have said is the increasing involvement of juveniles, because many of us have grown proud of the fact that our juvenile detention population has moved from over 200 youth in 2004 to last Friday about 34. And it would seem if one of the definitions of street gangs is that you're criminally involved at an increasingly earlier age, we would have more youth in jail. I don't know if that's counterintuitive or what, but I would like to hear your perspective on it.
I think, Councilmember, in one respect, it goes hand in hand. With the street gangs seeing that juveniles don't end up incarcerated as often or only are incarcerated for violent felonies.
Serious.
That they get more work out of them. They're recruiting at those younger ages. They're attempting to bring them in and use them at those younger ages. And in some cases, individuals, juveniles obviously have a first offense. First offense is usually categorized for diversion or it's categorized for probation. And so when you're looking at these young members, they wouldn't have that incarceration until probably third, fourth, or fifth offense in some cases, depending on the severity of the crime. So having a juvenile who joins a gang go out and commit a homicide would be extremely rare to have that be their first crime.
Yeah.
They're going to walk up that ladder and build up. It's going to start with graffiti. It's going to start with low-level things and simple assaults. And the juvenile, the 13, 14, 15-year-old gang member who goes out and starts doing shootings is very rare. They're usually going to progress up to that point, but not unheard of.
Do you all coordinate activities with other law enforcement bodies like the city of Seattle and the city of Burien that you mentioned earlier?
We do on occasion. Burien's contract city with us, and so that's technically part of the sheriff's office. We do work with pretty much any other law enforcement agency in this tri-county area on a regular basis, and I personally am involved in the oversight for WAGANG, which is our statewide gang database. And so I work statewide with other agencies on behalf of that.
Okay. I have a question on intersectionality of gangs, firearm deaths, and injuries, because gang violence is something we hear a lot of, but I don't necessarily know how much is based on perception or reality. So that's why I'm asking, is there intersectionality from your perspective with gangs, firearm deaths, and serious injury that involves generally juvenile age youngsters?
I would say there is. Giving an actual statistic on that is difficult because you would have to determine whether the crime is gang motivated, which we would definitely call a gang-related crime, or whether it's just gang involved. Is it just an individual who is a gang member who did that shooting, but it's not necessarily in connection with the street gang, right? Because individuals can commit crimes on their own that don't necessarily benefit the gang. So it might have been a personal beef with a non-gang involved person. We wouldn't want to tag that as a gang-related crime. So providing actual statistics for that would be difficult, given the way we track statistics. But I can say that I would say that there is definitely an intersectionality between those three factors.
Okay. And then my last question, to go to other members, because we have a couple other items on our agenda, is whether or not you see or have interaction with or coordinating efforts with programs that are trying to address violent gang activities and youth that are members of gang. We have several groups that Best Starts for Kids and others are funding now, and they are composed of a lot of people, both staff and supporters who have lived experiences as juvenile gangsters and residents of our youth detention center or jail in the past. Are you aware those groups exist, and is there coordination or recognition or referral of youth to those programs? I don't know how it works.
I'm certainly aware they exist. Since the beginning of when I first came up here, I've been involved with working in them. When Pete Carroll first took over the Seahawks, I met with him with a Better Seattle and trying to get them on board, bring them on board with the way things are here, because obviously he was doing a Better LA before that. We worked with our youth mentoring program that we had in-house at King County with 3 mentors embedded in high schools until I believe that was a grant that ended that was operating with that. I worked with our GREAT program, Gang Resistance Education and Training, that had great officers like DARE officers embedded in high schools, helping work with that. And I provide all kinds of training and awareness presentations to kind of get people aware of what's going on in front of them. The position I'm in now, I don't specifically work with those groups, but the gang unit that we've just created has as one of their primary mandates exactly that. And they're newly established, still trying to get their feet under the ground, on the ground, and figure out what their exact mission is going to be. But they are working with, I know they're working with Link. I know they're working with the Better Seattle, with the Seattle Youth Violence Prevention Initiative. I know there are definitely groups that I know they're working with, reaching out to, attempting to establish relationships or continue established relationships that were created by the Burien Special Emphasis Team or our Burien School Resource Officers when they've been working gang prevention on their own individually. So we're kind of shifting that focus to that gang unit now. So we're just kind of trying to figure out exactly how all that works. But we are definitely aware of it, and we are definitely attempting to do something about it.
Thank you. Now I'd like to see if any of my colleagues have any final questions before we move on. I'm sorry, Councilmember Up the Grove.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll take you up on it, Councilor Lambert, because it's kind of a follow-up on that last one. I think I grew up in Burien. That was my hometown, and I think, as you know, there have been a number of high-profile tragedies there, and I think the visibility of gang violence has increased, and it's partly why I was excited about the opportunity to help provide some funding for some enhanced police enforcement. And at the time, I think you actually just mentioned a minute ago that part of the core mission of this new to be developed gang unit, I think even the spokesperson for the department said at the time, was to go out and connect with neighborhoods and community groups. And you talked a little bit about what they're doing. But do you know specifically in South King County, there's a number of organizations working on the prevention side that are non-governmental related. I think of a group called Safe Futures and others. I'm wondering if you know if they're at the point where they're connecting with those organizations. And you mentioned Link, and that was my other question. For those who don't know, that's the coordinating council on gangs that started in South King County that's focused on kind of systems reform and connection to services. And is the thought that someone will be participating regularly with Link, do you know? And so I guess those are the two questions, kind of South King County specific, whether or not they're connecting with some of the prevention nonprofits and whether or not they'll be formally participating in Link.
I know that I don't know what the definition of formally would be. I know that they have meetings, and that before our gang unit was established, Isaac Arend, who was our Burien School Resource Officer, Evan Butow and Rick Cueva, who are our Special Emphasis Team guys, were regularly attending those meetings. And I know that since the gang unit formed and Alex Hawley took over as the detective, he's been regularly attending those Link meetings as well. I also know that just last week, Cueva and Hawley both sent a referral over to Link for somebody that could be a good person for gang intervention. So I do know that we're actively involved with Link for sure. With some of those other non-governmental agencies, part of the thing that law enforcement has to do before we work with those is vet some of the people that are involved in. I can tell you right now there's 2 of them that we have, 2 of those groups where there are individuals that we have concerns about what their current level of involvement may actually be. So, if you've been around Burien for a while, you remember that Burien tried to do something like that on our own way back when and got burned. So we have cold feet maybe a little bit because of that. But we definitely have to vet who we're working with in that regard, because we don't want to give somebody an authority over children, or refer somebody to help somebody when they have different motives. So.
Thanks. I know it's a cliche, but that was an ounce of prevention, pound of cure. And so if there's ways the gang unit can leverage those quality resources that are out there, it'll probably help you in the long run too.
The only way we're going to stop this is by preventing the next generation from forming.
Okay, Councilmember Lambert.
Thank you. So it used to be CCCJ, and then they changed the name to Link. And so Ross, do you remember Ross in my office?
Yes.
He used to attend those before he died, and now Lane attends those meetings. So we do have somebody from our council staff that goes to those meetings. Mm-hmm. And one of the things I was really impressed with is that there was a lot of work done early on data collection statewide and the definitions, and making sure that the data all across the state could be collected in the same way, which was not an easy job. So thank you for all your work on that. And then the schools in that district area that are the pilot schools have really been very collaborative, and so that's been great. So I have two questions. How involved are the cartels here with the gangs, especially bringing up drugs from Mexico? And secondly, your comment that youth with gangs, let me answer that one first, and then I'll give you the second question.
It's certainly not like end of watch. The cartel activity there are cartels that are active up here. There's cartel activity up here. But the cartel and street gang connection up here is nothing like it is in Los Angeles. And I attribute that largely to the fact that in Los Angeles and California, you have the Mexican Mafia, which is a prison gang that controls all Sereno gang activity for the state. And the Mexican Mafia, since 1995, has had one of their goals being taking over narcotics activity in Los Angeles, which has been the driver for some of that black versus brown race violence that's been going on down there. But essentially, down there, you have the Mexican Mafia who wants to take over this narcotics trade, and the cartels control that narcotics trade. So you have the Mafia and the cartel working hand in hand, and Sereno gangs basically have to do what the Mafia tells them, and so you have this almost requirement that Sereno gangs down there, if they want to be involved in narcotics, will work with cartels. We don't have a Mexican Mafia that controls our state in that way. We have individuals that control individual gangs, depending on where they're at and what connection they may have. But as a whole, we don't have that presence. It's an open state in terms of the cartels. We don't have any one cartel that controls our state. And so as it sits right now, if a gang wants to be involved, they certainly can. They can go there, but there's no reason for it. There's nobody ordering them to, and we don't see that level of connection that you see in other places between our street gangs and cartels.
That's great. And then your comment on the guns, that the children get out within 24 hours sometimes. And I realize we're trying to keep our average daily attendance at the jail, youth detention center down. However, the sooner you nip a bad behavior in the bud, the sooner that's going to be stopped. So do you think we need like an enhancement penalty where we say you don't get out in 24 hours if you've used a gun?
I think I don't think an enhancement penalty in terms of where you would add additional sentencing time. I don't think that's necessarily the answer. It would be nice if somebody that used a gun in a crime would be held longer until they could have a maybe more thorough evaluation of their danger they might pose to the community. Is this a one-time incident that this kid happened to be involved in, or is this part of a pattern? Is he a criminal street gang member who has been arrested for possession of firearms 3 or 4 times before, and this is the first time he's used it? You know, is that what's a more complete picture of the backstory, I think, might be effective in kind of limiting some of that danger posed to the community if they're returned early.